My daughter held up the box like it might have something crawling inside it. "What is this, Dad? Some kind of joke?" She turned it once in her hands, in front of 40 people at my own 64th birthday party, and let it drop back onto the gift table with a hollow little knock. A box. 60 years working with wood, and this is what you give me. Somewhere behind her a fork clinked against a plate and kept clinking, because nobody else in that backyard had the nerve to stop chewing. Nobody laughed yet. They were waiting to see if I would laugh first, the way people do when they aren't sure if the joke is over. I didn't. I stood there in my good shirt, holding a glass of lemonade I no longer wanted, and I watched my only child look at a piece of my life, like it was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. Somebody was going to answer for that box before the year was out. I didn't know it yet, standing on that lawn, but the person who answered for it wouldn't be Vanessa. It would be her husband, and it would happen on a Sunday in October, in front of a bank's entire board of trustees. With a document in my hand that I had been quietly preparing since the week after Easter. My name is Robert Calloway. I'm 64 years old, and for 41 of those years I restored antique furniture out of a workshop on Habersham Street in Savannah, Georgia. I've repaired secretaries that survived the Civil War, rebuilt the hinges on a wardrobe that came over on a ship from Bristol, and spent 11 months once coaxing the original finish back onto a Charleston rice planter's desk that a fire had nearly taken. I know wood the way some men know scripture. I know when it's telling the truth and when somebody has tried to make it lie. That's the whole of my life's work in 2 sentences. And it is going to matter more than you'd think before this story is finished. My wife Eleanor died 6 years ago this past spring. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late to matter much. Gone in 4 months from the day the doctor said the word. That loss doesn't get repaired. Furniture I can fix. Some things just have to be carried. Vanessa is 34. She was 7 pounds, 2 ounces when she was born, and I remember standing in that hospital hallway thinking I would move heaven itself if she ever needed it moved. For a long time, I believed that was true of her, too, that she'd have moved heaven for me. Then she married Preston Vance 9 years ago, and somewhere in those 9 years, without my ever quite catching the moment it happened, my daughter learned to look at me the way you look at a bill you're hoping will get lost in the mail. Preston sells real estate developments up and down the coast, the kind with names like Egret's Landing and Marsh Point Reserve, glossy brochures, model homes nobody actually lives in. For a few years it worked. Then interest rates climbed and 2 of his projects stalled with half-built houses standing in red Georgia clay like broken teeth, and the calls to me started. Could I co-sign a line of credit? Could I front the difference on a construction loan just until closings came through? Could I maybe think about updating my will so things were simpler for everybody down the road? I said no to the money more than once, and each no put another degree of frost into how Vanessa spoke to me on the phone. I should tell you something about myself before I go further, because I'm not going to pretend I came into this story as some unbothered old rock. I have been half-deaf in my left ear since 1997, when a table saw kicked back a length of walnut and the blade guard failed, and a piece of steel, the size of a pocket knife, opened my ear canal before it buried itself in the workshop wall 8 inches from my head. I healed. The hearing didn't. Not all the way. What that means practically is that in a loud room, a crowded restaurant, a church fellowship hall, a backyard full of 40 people, and a Bluetooth speaker playing Zydeco, sound comes at me from the wrong directions, doubled and smeared, and my body has never quite let go of the memory of that saw kicking, a door slamming behind me, a chair scraping too fast across concrete, a sudden clap of laughter. I flinch. Full body, can't help it flinch. The kind you can't train out of a nervous system, no matter how many decades pass. Eleanor used to reach over and rest 2 fingers on my forearm whenever we were somewhere loud, just so I'd have a hand to hold on to instead of a jump to make. Nobody's done that for me in 6 years. At my own birthday party, standing at the edge of that noisy lawn with my daughter holding my gift like a dead mouse, when somebody popped a bottle of Prosecco 3 feet behind me, I flinched so hard I nearly dropped my glass, and Preston laughed and said, "Easy there, old-timer," and 2 of Vanessa's friends laughed with him, and Vanessa didn't say a word in my defense. That's the kind of party it was turning into before anybody had even opened a gift. I want to be fair about how we got here, because it would be easy to make Vanessa into a villain from the first page, and easier still to make Preston one, and neither would be entirely honest. Vanessa was not always the woman who dropped a box on a table like it disgusted her. She used to sit on the floor of my workshop when she was 5 years old, sorting screws into a muffin tin by size while I worked, humming to herself, perfectly content. She used to call me at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday for no reason, except that she'd had a good day and wanted to tell somebody about it. Somewhere in the last 9 years, Preston's anxieties about money became her anxieties, and his resentment of a father-in-law who wouldn't simply hand things over became something she wore too. The way you catch a draft from somebody who leaves a door open too long. I don't fully understand how a daughter's voice changes as much as hers did. I only know that it did, and that I felt every degree of that change the way you feel weather turning. For my 64th birthday, Vanessa offered to host. That surprised me. She hadn't offered to host anything in 3 years, and I let myself hope it meant something. I should have known better than to let hope get that far ahead of the evidence, but a father does that. It's practically the job description. The party was in their backyard on a Saturday afternoon in late September, string lights already up for the evening, even though the sun was still high, a rented folding table sagging under casseroles, and a sheet cake with my name misspelled as Robet in blue icing that nobody had bothered to catch. 40-some guests, Vanessa's friends from her old sorority, a handful of Preston's business associates. I didn't recognize my sister Dot down from Macon, a few of my own longtime customers who'd become something like friends over the years. My granddaughter Sophie, 7 years old, spent most of the party under the gift table, pretending it was a fort, which was, in hindsight, the most honest use anybody made of that table all afternoon. I'd brought one gift myself, which might sound backward at your own birthday party, but I have never in my life shown up to see my daughter empty-handed, birthday or not, and this year I had something particular in mind. It was a box, cigar box-sized, cherry and rosewood, dovetailed corners I'd cut by hand, brass hinges I'd salvaged, and polished from a 19th century writing slope I'd once restored for a museum in Charleston and kept the extra hardware from out of habit. I'd spent 4 months on it in the evenings, working slower than I needed to, because the making of it was doing something for me that I hadn't quite named yet. Inside, wrapped in a square of white linen that had gone soft and yellow with age, was a handkerchief. And inside the false bottom beneath that handkerchief, a compartment cut so cleanly you'd need to know wood, the way I know it, to ever find the seam, was something else. Something I had been sitting on, in every sense of the word. For 5 months, I set the box on the gift table myself, between a gift bag from Dot and a bottle of scotch from one of Preston's associates, and I didn't say much about it. I'd planned to explain it quietly later, once the crowd thinned, not because it was shameful, but because what was inside deserved a hush, not an audience. I didn't get the chance to choose the moment. Vanessa chose it for me. It was somewhere around 4 in the afternoon when she decided, with a champagne flute in one hand and a small crowd of her friends gathered near the gift table for the traditional opening, that my present would be first. "Let's see what Dad got me for my own party," she said, laughing, and there was an edge under the laugh that I recognized immediately, the same edge that had been creeping into her voice on the phone for 2 years now. She tore the paper off in one motion and held the box up, turning it, inspecting the joints the way you'd inspect something you suspected of being broken. "What is this, Dad? Some kind of joke?" I told you already what she said next. A box. 60 years working with wood, and this is what you give me. She set it down hard enough that the brass hinges rattled, and for one horrible second I thought she was going to open it right there, flip the lid and expose that folded linen square in front of 40 people who had no earthly idea what it meant, no context for the day it came from, nothing but the sight of an old stained cloth to make of it whatever cruel, easy joke occurred to them first. My stomach dropped the way it used to drop watching a piece of century-old veneer lift under too much heat That specific fear of watching something irreplaceable come apart in real time. She didn't open it. She was too busy performing disappoint for her friends to bother finishing the gesture, which I suppose is the only mercy that afternoon offered me. She set it down, rolled her eyes, said something to the woman beside her that I couldn't hear over the ringing that loud rooms put in my bad ear, and moved on to the bottle of scotch, which she held up with considerably more enthusiasm. Now this, she said, somebody gets it. Preston laughed. A few of the others laughed with him, that easy social laughter that costs nothing and means less. The kind that exists mostly to keep a party moving rather than to express anything anyone actually feels. I don't think most of those 40 people were being cruel on purpose. I think most of them simply didn't notice, the way you don't notice a splinter going into someone else's hand. But I noticed. I stood there holding my lemonade, and I watched my daughter treat the most careful thing I had made in a decade like garbage. In front of people I'd have wanted to be proud in front of, and something in my chest went very quiet and very still, the way a workshop goes quiet, after you've finally solved a problem you've been circling for weeks. I want to be honest about a mistake I made that day, because I promised myself when I decided to tell this story that I wouldn't sand myself down into someone better than I actually was. My mistake was this. I said nothing. Vanessa's mother would have said something. Eleanor never let an unkindness pass unremarked in her presence, not even a small one, not even from family. I used to lean on her for that particular kind of courage. Without her standing beside me, I discovered that afternoon just how much of my spine over the years had actually belonged to my wife. I stood there and let my daughter humiliate a gift I'd built with my own 2 hands, in front of a crowd, on the anniversary of my own birth, and I said not one word in the box's defense. I told myself I was being the bigger person. Looking back, I think I was simply afraid. Afraid that if I said something, I'd say everything, and I wasn't ready yet for everything to be said. Dot found me 20 minutes later, standing near the fence at the edge of the yard where the party noise thinned out enough for my ear to stop ringing. My sister has never in her life let a silence sit uninterrogated. You've had that look on your face since the box, she said. What was in it, really? Because that girl doesn't know what she just threw away. And I don't mean sentimentally, Robert. I mean, I watched your face when she picked it up, and it was not the face of a man who wrapped up a trinket. It wasn't a trinket, I said. I didn't figure. You going to tell her? Not today. I watched Sophie crawl out from under the gift table, spot the box sitting slightly askew where Vanessa had dropped it, pick it up with both hands the careful way children handle things adults have just discarded, and carry it a few steps toward the house before her mother called her back to blow out candles. Something in my chest loosened a fraction watching that. My granddaughter, at least, had handled it like it mattered. She's not ready to hear it today. Maybe she never will be. But I've got a thing or two to finish before I decide that. Dot studied me for a long moment with the particular squint she's used on me since we were children, and she could tell I was about to do something she wasn't going to be told about in advance. You're planning something. I'm finishing something, I said. There's a difference. What I didn't tell Dot that afternoon, what I hadn't told anyone except my lawyer, a good man named Walter Pruitt, who'd handled Eleanor's estate and mine for going on 15 years, was where the second half of that box's contents had come from, and why I'd spent 5 careful, quiet months deciding what to do about it. It started, as most things in my life start, with a piece of furniture. In April, an old acquaintance named Harold Ellery, who sat on the board of a regional trust bank downtown, brought me a lap desk that had belonged to his late mother, a small mahogany writing box with a warped lid and a drawer that had swelled shut with humidity. Simple job, the kind I could do with my eyes closed after 4 decades. While I was working the drawer free, easing it out a fraction of an inch at a time so the old dovetails wouldn't crack, a folded sheet of paper that had been wedged behind the drawer's back panel for who knows how many years slipped loose and fell onto my workbench. It wasn't mine to read. I want that on the record plainly, because everything that followed depends on you understanding I never went looking for what I found. It came to me the way splinters come to a woodworker's hands unbidden, through the ordinary conduct of my trade. It was a photocopy, not an original, 3 pages, financial in nature, the kind of document that means nothing to a layman, and everything to a man who spent 40 years learning to notice when something has been altered. A signature page. And beneath the signature, because restoring old finishes teaches you to look at surfaces at a raking angle, to see beneath what's been laid on top, I could tell, even without instruments, that the signature had been traced. Not forged badly. Forged well by someone patient, someone who'd practiced. But traced all the same, and I know the particular unnatural evenness of a traced line, the way a doctor knows the particular hitch of a heart that isn't beating right. I called Harold, told him his mother's desk was ready, and asked, as casually as I could manage, whether he recognized the document that had fallen loose from behind the drawer. He went quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then he told me it looked like paperwork from a family trust his bank had processed the year before, a modest educational trust, the kind grandparents set up for grandchildren's college funds. This one established years back by a woman named Eleanor Calloway for the benefit of her granddaughter, Sophie Vance, administered with a co-trustee arrangement that had been quietly amended 18 months ago to grant broader withdrawal authority to Sophie's father. I sat in my workshop for a long while after that call, Eleanor's handwriting, or something meant to pass for it, sitting on my bench under the lamp. My wife had set up that trust the year before she got sick, put a portion of her own inheritance from her mother into it, meant every penny for Sophie's education and nothing else, and had told me more than once, in the specific voice she used for things she considered settled and not open to negotiation, that no one, not Vanessa, not Preston, not I, was to touch a dollar of it before Sophie turned 18, and here was a signature meant to look like hers, on a document that had quietly widened the gate. I didn't confront anyone that week. I've learned, over 40 years of pulling apart other people's mistakes to fix them, that the worst thing you can do with a discovery like that is act on it before you understand its full shape. I called Walter Pruitt instead, showed him what I had, and he confirmed within a day that the trust's withdrawal records over the past 14 months showed 6 disbursements totaling just over $91,000, each one routed, after a short stop in an account bearing Sophie's name, into accounts controlled by Preston Vance's development company. Walter's exact words to me, sitting in his office on Bull Street with the blinds half drawn against the afternoon sun, were, "Robert, I can start proceedings on this today if you want to, but once we start, there's no undoing it. You'll want to think about what you're actually trying to protect before you set this in motion, the money, or your family." I told him I needed time. He gave it to me. And in that time, instead of picking up the phone and destroying everything in one furious afternoon the way some part of me wanted to, I did the only thing that has ever made sense to me when I don't know what to do with my hands or my grief. I built something. I copied the documents, sealed them along with Harold's original photocopy inside a section of the box I was already building for Vanessa's birthday, cut a false bottom so fine you'd need a restorer's eye to find the seam, and told myself, maybe foolishly, maybe out of some stubborn old hope I hadn't fully let go of, that I would give her the box first, as a test with no rules she knew she was being tested by, and let what she did with an unremarkable-looking gift tell me something true about who my daughter had become. If she opened it with care, the way Sophie had carried it across the yard, I told myself I'd find a gentler way into the conversation about what her husband had done. If she didn't, well, I hadn't quite let myself finish that thought before the party, if I'm honest. I finished it standing at that fence, watching Sophie set the box carefully on the porch step before her mother called her in for cake. The party wound down around 7. Guests trickled out with the particular loose, sunburned tiredness that outdoor parties leave people with, hugging Vanessa, shaking Preston's hand, wishing me happy birthday on their way past with the specific brightness people use when they sense they've witnessed something they'd rather not examine too closely. Dot hugged me hard at the car and told me to call her, which from Dot means something closer to an order than a request. I looked for the box before I left and didn't see it on the gift table anymore. Sophie must have carried it inside at some point after cake, out from under the porch step where she'd left it, And I told myself that was fine, that it would still be there whenever Vanessa decided it was worth a second look, whenever that turned out to be. I drove home to my house on Gaston Street with the windows down, because September evenings in Savannah are the one mercy the month gives you after a summer like that one, and I sat for a while on my own back steps once I got there, listening to the neighborhood settle into dusk, thinking about Eleanor and about how she would have handled that afternoon, probably by saying something sharp and true the moment Vanessa opened her mouth, and probably being right to. I thought about the box sitting somewhere inside my daughter's house, holding more truth than any single object I'd ever built, and about how strange it was that I'd spent 4 months making something beautiful specifically so it could carry something devastating inside it, the same way I once spent 11 months restoring a fire-scared desk, not because the wood underneath deserved saving on its own merits, but because someone had loved it enough once that the saving mattered. I didn't hear from Vanessa that night. I didn't expect to. What I didn't know, couldn't have known, sitting on those back steps with the last of the light going soft and orange over the rooftops, was that at 9:40 that evening, in a guest bedroom she and Preston used as a home office, my daughter would finally set down the glass of wine she'd been nursing all through the guests' goodbyes, pick up the box she'd humiliated in front of 40 people that afternoon, and, alone this time, with no one watching and nothing left to perform, actually open it. Vanessa would tell me later, much later, on a night neither of us had planned for and both of us needed, that she almost didn't open it at all. She said she'd carried it inside, mostly because Sophie had left it on the porch step, and she didn't want raccoons getting into the wrapping paper overnight, and she'd set it on the corner of the desk, in the room they called the office, though it mostly functioned as the place where unopened mail went to be forgotten. She said she looked at it twice while she was closing up the kitchen, and both times decided it wasn't worth the trouble. The third time, Preston was already asleep. He'd had more of the scotch than the party really called for, and the house had gone that particular quiet a house gets once the noise of 40 people has finally drained out of it, a quiet that makes you hear your own thoughts whether you want to or not. Vanessa told me she sat down at the desk with the last of her wine, picked the box up mostly out of guilt, and turned it over once in her hands the way she had at the party, except this time nobody was watching her do it, and there was no crowd to perform disappointment for. She noticed the hinges first. She told me this later with a kind of wonder in her voice that I hadn't heard from her in years. She said she ran her thumb over the brass and realized, for the first time, that it wasn't hardware store hardware. It had the soft, hand-finished irregularity that only comes from something polished slowly, by hand, over hours. She noticed the dovetails next, the way they interlocked without a single visible gap, and she told me she thought, unbidden, Dad doesn't do sloppy work, so why did I assume this was sloppy? She said that thought embarrassed her enough that she almost put the box down and went to bed rather than sit with it. She opened it instead. The linen square was on top, folded the way I'd folded it, soft with age, in a way that new fabric can't fake no matter how you try. She lifted it out, and beneath it lay the handkerchief. Plain white cotton, a man's handkerchief. The kind that used to come 3 to a package from the drugstore, with a rust-brown stain across one corner that had gone the color old blood goes after enough years. A color that isn't quite red anymore, and isn't quite brown. The color of something that happened a long time ago and was never meant to be looked at by anyone but the person who kept it. She told me her first thought, sitting alone at that desk at nearly 10 at night, was that it looked like a bandage someone had forgotten to throw away. Her second thought, arriving right behind the first, the way second thoughts do when you're too tired and too far into a glass of wine to guard against them properly, was, why would he give me this? Not as an insult. As a genuine question, the kind that opens a door you can't close again once you've stepped through it. She unfolded it. Inside the handkerchief, wrapped a second time, was a small enameled locket. Eleanor's, the one with the tiny hinged photograph inside that Vanessa hadn't seen since she was a girl. Since before her mother got sick, a locket Vanessa had been told for years was lost. And beneath where the locket had sat, tucked into the linen, was a single folded sheet of paper in my handwriting. I'd written that letter in March, sitting up late at my own kitchen table, and rewritten it 4 times before I let myself keep a version. I won't pretend I remember every word of it now, but I remember the shape of what it said, because I'd carried the shape of it in my chest for months before I ever put it to paper. It told her about the day she was 5 years old, and I pulled her out of her mother's car after a delivery truck ran the light on Victory Drive and put us into the median at 40 miles an hour. It told her that the windshield had come apart in a way that put glass into both of my forearms and one long, deep gash across the back of my right hand, and that I hadn't felt any of it in the moment, hadn't felt anything at all except her crying from the back seat and the smell of gasoline, and my own voice telling her over and over that Daddy had her, that she was going to be fine. It told her that once I'd gotten her clear of the car and set her down on the grass median and satisfied myself she wasn't hurt anywhere worse than a scraped knee, my hand had been bleeding badly enough that a stranger who'd stopped to help pressed his own handkerchief into it to slow the bleeding until the ambulance came, and that I'd kept that handkerchief, never washed it, never could bring myself to, because it was the only physical thing that survived from the worst and most important 10 minutes of my life. It told her that Eleanor had kept the locket separately all those years, meaning to give it to her on her wedding day, but that grief and cancer and the speed with which everything went at the end had gotten in the way, and that I'd been carrying it since, waiting for a day that felt right, and that I'd finally decided this was the day, her father's 64th birthday, for reasons that had more to do with what I was afraid of losing than what I was celebrating. The letter did not mention Preston. It did not mention money, or the trust, or the second compartment sitting beneath the linen with its own careful seam. I'd made a decision, in the writing of it, that whatever this letter did or didn't accomplish, it would do it honestly, on its own terms, without being weaponized into the first move of a larger fight. I wanted, if nothing else survived that night, for my daughter to read one true thing from her father that had nothing to do with anything he needed from her. Vanessa told me she read that letter 3 times before she could stand up from the desk. She told me she sat there afterward with the locket in one hand and the handkerchief in the other, and that the first thing she felt, underneath the shock, was a kind of physical nausea at the memory of her own voice that afternoon. "What is this, Dad?" Some kind of joke, replaying itself against the sound of 40 people laughing at a box she now understood she had never actually looked at. She said she thought about Sophie carrying it carefully across the yard, 7 years old and somehow more attentive to what mattered than her own mother had been, and that thought was the one that finally broke something loose in her chest. She did not that night find the false bottom. I want to be honest about the order these things happened in because it matters to what came after. She sat with the letter and the locket and the handkerchief until well past midnight, and then, she told me, she did something she was faintly embarrassed to admit to later. She got up, went to the hall closet, pulled out an old sewing kit that had belonged to her grandmother, and very carefully, very gently, cleaned the outside of the box with a soft cloth and a little furniture oil she found under the kitchen sink. Not knowing anything about restoration, not doing it correctly by any professional standard, doing it the way you clean something you've suddenly understood you were careless with and want badly to make some kind of amends to. It was that cleaning, that late-night amateur polishing done out of guilt rather than curiosity, that finally caught the seam. She told me she noticed it because the oil brought out a faint discoloration along one interior edge that hadn't been visible dry, a hairline where the grain didn't quite continue the way grain should continue. The kind of thing I'd have spotted in half a second, and she only found by accident, running her thumb along it while she worked the cloth into a corner. She pressed on it. Nothing happened, because I'd built the release the way I build every hidden compartment, requiring a specific counterpressure at a specific point rather than a simple push, a habit from 40 years of restoring writing desks that hide love letters and cash boxes that hide who knows what, always built with the assumption that whoever eventually found the seam should have to actually want to solve it. She spent almost 20 minutes running her fingers over every inch of the box's interior before she found the second pressure point by accident. At the same moment, she was thinking about giving up, and the false bottom lifted free with a small, dry click that she said she felt more than heard. Inside were 3 folded sheets of paper, Harold's photocopy, the trust records Walter had pulled together, and a single page in my own handwriting summarizing, plainly and without embellishment, what I understood to have happened. That a trust her mother had established for Sophie's education had been quietly amended, that a signature purporting to be Eleanor's had been placed on that amendment 18 months after Eleanor was no longer alive to sign anything, and that 6 disbursements totaling $91,000 had since moved from that trust into accounts belonging to Preston's development company. Vanessa told me she read that second letter standing up in her bare feet on the office floor at nearly 1 in the morning, and that her first reaction was not grief but a kind of cold, complete disbelief. Not disbelief that it was possible, she said, but disbelief that she hadn't caught it herself, that she'd been in the same house as those bank statements for over a year, and never once looked closely enough to see what was moving through them. She told me she went back over Preston's explanations for the past year and a half in her head, one by one, standing there in the dark. The sudden influx of cash that had let them make payroll on the Egret's Landing project last spring, the closing costs he'd covered without asking her for help the way he usually did, the new truck he'd bought in June that he'd told her came from a signing bonus on a deal she'd never heard the details of. And she said each explanation, examined honestly for the first time, came apart in her hands like wet paper. She did not wake Preston that night. She told me later that some cold, careful part of her mind, a part she didn't entirely recognize in herself, understood immediately that confronting him at 1 in the morning, exhausted and half a bottle of wine into the evening, would accomplish nothing except giving him time and warning to build a story before anyone with real authority ever asked him a real question. She put both sets of documents back into the box, closed the false bottom, and sat with it in her lap on the office floor until nearly 3 in the morning. And somewhere in those 2 hours, she told me, she cried harder than she had since her mother's funeral. Not for Preston, not yet, but for the version of the afternoon she'd have given anything to take back. The 40 guests, the champagne flute, the words some kind of joke coming out of her own mouth about the single most careful thing her father had ever made her. She called me at 7 the next morning. I was on my second cup of coffee, sitting at my kitchen table with the newspaper I still take out of habit, though I mostly read it on a screen these days. And when my phone rang and I saw her name on the screen, my first thought, I'll admit this plainly, was that she was calling to apologize for the party, and my second thought, closer to the truth of what I actually felt, was that I didn't fully trust myself yet to know how I'd respond if that's all it turned out to be. It wasn't. She didn't say hello. She said, "Dad, is this real?" And her voice had a crack running through it that I hadn't heard since she was small enough to still climb into my lap when she was scared of something. The letter. The locket. Did that actually happen? The accident. She stopped. I could hear her breathing on the other end, ragged, like she'd been crying recently and hadn't fully stopped. And the other papers. Dad, is that real too? I told her it was. All of it. I didn't soften anything, and I didn't add anything either. I'd made a promise to myself back in March that whatever this box eventually did in the world, I wasn't going to be the one to spin it once it left my hands. And I held to that on the phone that morning, even though every instinct in me wanted to ask her, right then, whether she understood now what she'd done at the party, whether she felt the shape of what her mockery had actually cost. I didn't ask. I let her get there on her own, because some part of me, the part that spent 40 years learning that you can't rush wood, that pressure applied too fast splits grain that would have bent beautifully if you'd just given it time, understood that this was not a morning for pushing. "I need to see you," she said. "Today, please." I told her to come alone. She didn't argue the way I half expected her to. She said, "I know," in a voice that told me she'd already understood, before I'd asked, exactly why alone mattered. She arrived at my house a little before 9 that morning, And I want to tell you honestly that I did not know, standing at my own front door, watching her get out of her car with the box held against her chest with both arms, the way you'd carry something fragile through a crowd, whether the next hour was going to be the beginning of getting my daughter back or the end of whatever thin thread had still been connecting us. I'd spent 5 months preparing the second compartment of that box for a confrontation with Preston. I had not, if I'm honest, spent 1 full minute preparing myself for what it might mean to watch my own daughter walk toward me, holding the evidence of her husband's fraud against her chest, like it was something she needed to protect. She didn't say anything on the porch. She set the box down on the little table between the 2 rocking chairs where Eleanor and I used to sit most evenings, and then she did something I hadn't expected and wasn't at all braced for. She put both arms around me, the way she hadn't in longer than I could easily place, and she held on hard enough that I felt, for just a moment, 7 pounds 2 ounces again, my whole chest full of something I hadn't let myself feel in front of her in years. "I'm sorry," she said into my shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Dad, about the party, about all of it. I don't even know where to start being sorry." I didn't answer right away. Some things deserve a silence before you try to put words around them, and I've learned that from wood too. You don't rush the glue, you don't force a joint before it's ready to be forced. You let the thing sit clamped and quiet until it's actually set. I held on to my daughter on that porch for a good while before either of us said another word, and when I finally did speak, what came out surprised even me. "I flinched at my own birthday party," I said. "When the bottle popped behind me, you didn't notice." She pulled back enough to look at me confused, and I told her, for the first time in years, maybe the first time ever, in that much plain detail about the table saw in '97, about the ear, about the particular kind of loud room that still, after almost 30 years, sends my whole body back to that afternoon before my mind can catch up and tell it it's safe. I told her Preston had laughed when it happened, called me old-timer, and that 2 of her friends had laughed along with him, and that she hadn't said a word. "I didn't even see it happen," she said, and her voice had gone very small. "Dad, I didn't even see you flinch." "I know," I said. "That's what I've been trying to tell myself all week doesn't matter." It matters. We sat on that porch for close to 2 hours that morning, and most of what got said in that time belongs to Vanessa and me and nobody else, so I won't lay all of it out here. But by the time she left, we'd agreed on 2 things. The first was that she would say nothing to Preston yet, not out of any wish to protect him, but because both of us understood, without needing to argue it out loud, that whatever came next needed to happen with Walter Pruitt and a proper legal process standing behind it, not with an accusation shouted across a kitchen that Preston could later claim was some kind of misunderstanding born of grief and an old man's confusion. The second was that she would come with me to Walter's office that Monday morning, and that whatever happened after that, divorce, prosecution, some version of both, she wanted to be the one who set it in motion, not me. "He stole from our daughter," she said, standing at her car before she left, the box back in her arms again, though held differently now, close against her chest the way you hold something you've finally understood the weight of. "I don't want you carrying that on your own anymore. I've let you carry too much on your own for too long." I stood on my porch and watched her drive away, and for the first time since Eleanor died, I let myself believe, carefully, the way you test a repaired joint before you trust your full weight to it, that something broken in my family might actually be capable of being set right, rather than simply endured. Walter Pruitt's office sits on the second floor of a converted cotton warehouse on Bull Street, and I have spent enough hours in that particular room over the years. Eleanor's estate, my own will, 2 decades of small business questions before I finally retired, that I know exactly which chair by the window catches the morning light best. Vanessa took that chair on Monday morning, the box sitting closed on her lap the whole meeting, like she needed something solid to hold on to while Walter laid out, in his careful, unhurried courtroom voice, exactly what the documents inside it meant. 6 disbursements, Walter said, sliding printed statements across the desk so Vanessa could see them for herself rather than take anyone's word for it, averaging just over $15,000 each, spaced roughly 10 weeks apart, beginning 14 months ago. Every one of them requires the signature of both trustees. Your father, Robert, as surviving co-trustee, and the primary trustee, which was your mother until her passing, and which the amendment 18 months ago transferred to Preston in the event of her death or incapacity. He tapped the amendment page. This is the document your father found. Your mother's signature on it is dated 11 weeks after she died. Vanessa didn't say anything for a long moment. She was looking at the signature, and I watched something settle in her face that I recognized from my own workshop. The particular stillness that comes when you finally see, with your own eyes, in good light, the thing you'd been suspecting but hadn't let yourself fully believe. He forged my mother's signature, she said. Not a question. Somebody did, Walter said. I'd want forensic confirmation before we say it in a room with consequences attached. But yes, someone forged your mother's signature 11 weeks after she was no longer alive to have signed anything, in order to grant Preston sole withdrawal authority over a trust established for your daughter's education. He looked at me, then back at Vanessa. Your father found this by accident, doing furniture work for a family friend on the trust's board. He spent the last 5 months quietly gathering documentation instead of confronting anyone, because he wanted to be certain before he did anything that couldn't be undone. I want you to understand what kind of restraint that took, because in 20 years of doing this work, I don't see it often. I hadn't expected Walter to say that out loud, and I felt my face go warm in a way I hadn't in years. Vanessa looked over at me, and something passed between us that didn't need words. What do we do? She said. Walter laid it out plainly. We could pursue this quietly through the trust's internal remedies first. Formal removal of Preston as trustee, restoration of the withdrawn funds through a civil claim against him personally, all handled through the bank's trust department and, if necessary, probate court, without ever involving criminal charges. Or, if the forgery could be independently confirmed, the bank's own compliance obligations would likely require them to refer the matter to the district attorney's office, regardless of what any of us wanted, because a forged signature on a financial instrument isn't the kind of thing a regulated trust department gets to quietly overlook once it's been formally reported. Once you report this to Harold Ellery and the bank, Walter said, you lose control of how far it goes. I want you both walking in with your eyes open about that. Good, Vanessa said, and her voice had a flatness to it I'd never heard from her before. Not angry exactly, past anger, into something colder and steadier. I don't want to control it, I want it stopped. We drove to the bank together that same afternoon. Harold Ellery met us in a conference room with 2 compliance officers I didn't know, and Vanessa laid the documents out herself, page by page, in an order she and Walter had worked out that morning. The original amendment, the withdrawal records, the photocopy that had fallen out of Harold's mother's writing desk. Harold went very quiet reading through them. When he finally looked up, he said, I'm going to need to report this formally today. I want you to understand that once I do, this stops being a family matter that the bank quietly resolves. This becomes an active fraud investigation, and it will likely involve law enforcement. He looked at Vanessa specifically. Are you prepared for that? He stole from my daughter, she said. I've had 2 days to be prepared for it. Report it. The bank's investigation moved faster than any of us expected, mostly because, as it turned out, Preston was not nearly as careful a man as the forged signature suggested. Within a week, the bank's compliance team had traced the pattern of disbursements to accounts held by a shell entity called Coastal Ridge Holdings, which on paper belonged to Preston's development company, but which, when the forensic accountant the bank brought in started pulling threads, turned out to have a second signatory nobody in our family had ever heard of. A man named Curtis Boyle, listed as a strategic partner on Coastal Ridge's formation documents, filed 11 months before the first disbursement from Sophie's trust ever moved. I want to tell you what we learned about Curtis Boyle plainly, because it changed the shape of this story in a way none of us saw coming, and because I think it matters to understanding Preston, even if it doesn't excuse him. Curtis Boyle had been Preston's business school roommate 20 years earlier, and by the forensic accountant's reckoning, he'd spent the better part of the last 3 years quietly maneuvering himself into control of Preston's failing development company through a series of bridge loans that came with increasingly aggressive terms that, if Preston ever defaulted, would hand Curtis a controlling stake in everything Preston owned, including, eventually, the house Vanessa and Sophie lived in. When the Egret's Landing project stalled and Preston came up short on a construction loan payment 14 months ago, it was Curtis, according to texts the investigators eventually recovered, who suggested, in a message that read, chillingly, "There's an easier way to solve this than another loan from me," that Preston borrow forward against his daughter's trust. And Curtis, who walked Preston through exactly how to alter the amendment paperwork to make it look properly executed. Preston, in other words, had committed the forgery. Preston had signed his dying mother-in-law's name to a document she never saw. But Preston had also spent 14 months being slowly, deliberately maneuvered by a man who understood exactly which of his fears to press on, and who had positioned himself, by the time the fraud was discovered, to walk away clean while Preston absorbed the entire fall. It didn't make what Preston did to my granddaughter's future any less real. It made it, in a strange way, sadder. A man drowning who'd reached for the one hand held out to him without checking first whose hand it was. I learned all of this the way I learn most things now, secondhand, through Walter and through Vanessa, because I had made a decision early on to stay out of the direct confrontations and let my daughter be the one to face her husband. Not because I lacked the will for it, but because I understood the way you understand grain direction with your hands before your eyes ever confirm it, that this needed to be her fight to have, not mine to have for her. But I was there for the one confrontation that couldn't be avoided, because it happened at my own dinner table, on a Sunday 2 weeks after the birthday party, before the bank investigation had gone fully public, when Preston, still not fully understanding how much we already knew, showed up uninvited at Vanessa's insistence to talk things through as a family. Sophie was there. That matters to what happened next. We were most of the way through dinner, an uncomfortable, careful meal that Vanessa had clearly hoped might still somehow steer toward reconciliation before it steered anywhere else. When Preston, 3 glasses of wine into an evening he'd started tense and kept getting tenser, finally said the thing that ended any possibility of that evening going gently. "You know what your mother would say about all this," he said to Vanessa. Not quite looking at me, his voice carrying the particular ugly confidence of a man whose decided attack is his best remaining move. "Eleanor always said, your father coddled you too much. She told me that herself, more than once. Said you needed to learn to stand on your own 2 feet instead of running back to Daddy's workshop every time life got hard. And now here you all are, running to Daddy again, treating me like a criminal over some paperwork. Like Eleanor wouldn't have wanted her own granddaughter's trust, helping keep this family's business afloat instead of sitting locked up for 11 years doing nothing." The table went silent in a way that had a physical weight to it. I felt the old flinch reflex rise in my chest. Not from noise this time, but from something worse. The specific violence of hearing a dead woman's name used as a weapon by a man who had forged her signature. I opened my mouth to answer him, and Sophie beat me to it. "Grandma wouldn't say that," she said. 7 years old, sitting very straight in her chair, her voice not loud but perfectly clear in the silence Preston had made. "Grandma made the box money for me. She told me before she got sick. She said it was for when I'm big, for school, so I don't have to worry." She looked at her father with a particular unguarded directness only children manage. No strategy in it, no anger yet, just honest confusion. "Why did you take my school money, Daddy?" I have sat in that same silence at 100 different moments in my life. The silence right after a glue joint either holds or gives way. The silence in an emergency room hallway. The silence on a lawn while 40 people wait to see if you'll laugh at your own humiliation. And I can tell you that none of them prepared me for the particular silence that followed my 7-year-old granddaughter asking her father, in front of the whole family, why he'd taken her school money. Preston's face went through 3 or 4 expressions in quick succession: anger, then something that looked almost like fear, then a kind of collapse that had nothing performed about it. And he didn't answer her. He couldn't. There was no version of an answer that survived being said out loud to a child. Vanessa stood up from the table, walked around to Sophie's chair, and crouched down beside her, and I heard her say, quietly, "Grandma would never say that, baby. You're right. Grandma loved you more than anything, and this isn't your fault, none of it." Then she stood, looked at Preston across the table with an expression I hadn't seen on her since she was a teenager standing up to a boy who'd been unkind to a friend, and said, "Get out of my father's house." He left. He didn't argue, which told me more than anything he might have said. Men who believe they're in the right tend to argue. Men who know, somewhere underneath the whine and the panic, exactly how badly they've failed tend to simply go quiet and leave. And that's what Preston did. Out my front door and down the porch steps into the dark. And none of us, sitting at that table afterward, said much of anything for a long while. It was Dot, 3 days later, who told me about the second thing that started happening once word of the investigation began working its way, quietly at first and then not quietly at all, through the particular small world circles of Savannah's business community. I want to be careful how I describe this part because it wasn't organized, wasn't anyone's plan, wasn't even something Vanessa or I asked for. It was simply what happens sometimes when people who've been paying more attention than you realized finally have a reason to say something. Harold Ellery's bank wasn't the only institution that heard about Preston's shell company and his arrangement with Curtis Boyle. 2 subcontractors who'd worked the Egret's landing site came forward on their own. Once they heard the bank had opened an investigation, with records of their own showing, Preston had shorted their final payments the same month that the first trust withdrawal went through. A woman named Rosalind Meyer, who ran the escrow office downtown and had processed closings for half the developers in the county over the years, called Walter directly to say she'd noticed something off about Coastal Ridge Holdings' paperwork over a year ago and had quietly flagged it internally, only for nothing to come of it at the time. None of these people knew me well, or knew Vanessa at all. They came forward because a piece of the truth had finally surfaced that made it safe to say what they'd already suspected, and because this is the part that undid me a little. When Dot told me about it, several of them mentioned, almost as an aside, that they'd always liked doing business with old Calloway, the furniture man, fair dealer, never once tried to shave a nickel off an honest quote in 40 years, and that a man like that deserved better than what his son-in-law had apparently done to his family. I hadn't asked anyone to say that. I don't think I'd ever fully understood, until Dot repeated it to me over the phone, how many small, honest transactions accumulate over 4 decades into something like a reputation, and how that reputation can turn out to be its own kind of trust fund, paying out exactly when you need it most, and never once asked for. The formal hearing on the trust's mismanagement was scheduled for the 3rd Sunday in October, a date that fell, entirely by coincidence, on Sophie's 8th birthday, which nobody had planned, and which struck all of us once we noticed, as either a cruel joke or a strange mercy, depending on how the day went. Walter had arranged it as a closed proceeding before the bank's trust committee, rather than a full courtroom, at least for the civil remedy portion, with the district attorney's office separately pursuing the forgery charge based on the bank's referral. Harold had asked, given the family circumstances, whether Vanessa wanted the civil hearing held privately or in a slightly larger room, since several of the people whose records had come forward had asked to be present as witnesses if needed. Vanessa, after thinking about it for a full day, said the larger room. "I spent 34 years thinking family business should stay quiet no matter what," she told me. "I watched it almost cost my daughter everything. I'm done deciding what's shameful based on what keeps people comfortable." The hearing room on the bank's 3rd floor was larger than I expected, more boardroom than courtroom, a long table at the front for the trust committee, and, behind it, 3 rows of chairs that Harold's office had set up almost apologetically, as though embarrassed to be anticipating a crowd for what was supposed to be private family business. By 9:30 that Sunday morning, every one of those chairs was full. I hadn't asked anyone to come. I want that understood plainly. because it would be easy to imagine I'd worked some quiet campaign the way Preston had worked his fraud, but I hadn't. I'd told exactly 3 people the date: Dot, Walter, and, out of old habit, Harold himself, and yet there in the third row sat Rosalind Meyer from the escrow office, and beside her the 2 subcontractors who'd come forward about their shorted payments, and behind them, to my genuine surprise, 4 of the customers I'd done restoration work for over the years, people I hadn't spoken to in months, sitting quietly with their hands folded, not there to testify, not asked to say a single word, just present. Dot sat in the front row with Sophie's teacher, of all people, whom Dot had apparently run into at the grocery store and mentioned the hearing to in passing, and who'd asked, unprompted, if she could come sit with the family. Nobody made a speech. Nobody stood up and demanded anything. They simply came and sat quietly, the way you show up at a funeral or a hospital waiting room, not because you can fix anything, but because a person shouldn't have to sit alone through the hardest morning of their life, if there's any way around it. Preston arrived with his own attorney 11 minutes late, and I watched him take in that crowded room from the doorway, watched something in his face falter at the sight of it, and I understood in that moment that he had genuinely believed, right up until he walked through that door, that this would still somehow be handled quietly, contained, survivable in the ordinary way that men like him were used to surviving things. Curtis Boyle did not appear. His attorney sent a letter, read into the record early in the proceeding, stating that Mr. Boyle would be cooperating fully with the district attorney's separate criminal investigation and had no further comment. Preston's face, hearing that read aloud, hearing, in effect, that the man who'd engineered the whole scheme had already begun quietly stepping backward out of the blast radius, leaving Preston standing in it alone, was the first time all morning I felt something close to pity for him. Harold ran the proceeding the way I imagine he ran every difficult meeting in that room, with a kind of careful, unhurried decency that never once tipped over into cruelty, even when cruelty would have been easy. He laid out the timeline. He entered the documents into the record, the amendment, the withdrawal history, the forensic accountant's tracing of the funds through Coastal Ridge Holdings, the escrow irregularities Rosalind had flagged a year earlier and never been able to act on alone. At no point did anyone read Sophie's private conversation with her father aloud, or repeat what Preston had said about Eleanor at my dinner table, and I understood, watching Walter carefully steer the proceeding around those moments, that this was deliberate, that whatever needed exposing in that room was exposed through documents that had already been verified and vetted, not through the raw, unguarded things a family says to itself in private. The financial specifics belonged in that room. The rest belonged to us. Preston's attorney tried for a while to argue that the amendment could have been executed with Eleanor's knowledge before her death and simply dated in error afterward. A thin argument, and everyone in the room seemed to know it was thin, including, I think, the attorney making it. It fell apart entirely when Harold produced the bank's own internal timestamp records showing the amendment document had been generated on the bank's system using a template updated only 11 weeks after Eleanor's death, meaning it could not possibly have existed in any form before she died. There was no ambiguity left after that. I watched it land on Preston's face, watched the last thin thread of a story he must have been telling himself for over a year finally give way, and he put both hands over his face and didn't move for almost a full minute. The trust committee's decision came swiftly after that. Preston removed as trustee, effective immediately. Full restoration of the $91,000 ordered, to be satisfied first through liquidation of his interest in Coastal Ridge Holdings, and, should that prove insufficient, through a civil judgment against him personally. The matter of the forged signature formally referred, as it had already begun to be, to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. Harold closed the proceeding by saying, more gently than I expected given everything that had just been laid bare, that the committee recognized this had cost the family far more than money, and that he hoped, in time, some of what had been lost could still be repaired. I don't know exactly what I expected to feel. sitting there watching a man's carefully built house of cards finally fall in on itself in front of a room full of witnesses. I'd spent 5 months preparing for that moment, had built an entire box around the evidence that made it possible, and I think some smaller, harder part of me had expected to feel something like satisfaction when it finally arrived. What I actually felt, watching Preston sit there with his face in his hands while Vanessa sat rigid and dry-eyed 3 seats away from him, was mostly just tired. Tired the way you're tired after you've finally finished a long, difficult repair. Not triumphant. Just done, and aware of everything the work had cost you to get there. We didn't stay for the aftermath in that room. The quiet murmur of people gathering their things, Preston's attorney speaking to him in a low, urgent voice, Harold shaking hands with people on his way out. Vanessa took Sophie's hand, and I put my arm around Dot, and the 4 of us walked out together into the kind of bright, ordinary October Sunday that doesn't care what's just happened inside a bank 3 floors up. And I remember standing on the sidewalk for a moment just breathing, the way you breathe once you finally set down something heavy you'd stopped noticing the weight of because you'd been carrying it so long. I want to tell you about what happened 2 weeks later, because I think it matters more to this story than the hearing did, even though the hearing is the part that would make the better headline if anyone were writing this up as news instead of as the truth of my own family. Vanessa asked if she and Sophie could come by the workshop on a Saturday afternoon, not the house, the workshop, which she hadn't set foot in with any regularity since she was a teenager. I said, of course, and spent that morning doing what I always do before anyone comes by, tidying tools that didn't especially need tidying, more out of nervous habit than necessity. When they arrived, Sophie went straight for the workbench the way she used to when she was small, running her hand along the wood the way children do, testing textures, and Vanessa stood in the doorway for a long moment just looking around at the half-finished pieces on their sawhorses, the wall of clamps, the particular sawdust and varnish smell that hasn't changed in 41 years. I used to sit right there, she said, pointing to a spot on the floor near my main bench, and sort your screws into the muffin tin. Do you remember that? I remember, I said. You were very serious about it, wouldn't let me touch the tin once you'd sorted it, not even to find a screw I actually needed. She laughed. A real laugh. The first one I'd heard from her in longer than I wanted to think about, and then she went quiet. And I watched her work up to something the way I've watched plenty of pieces of furniture work up, to finally giving up whatever they'd been hiding. I want to say something, she said, and I need you to let me get all the way through it. Because if you stop me, I don't think I'll manage it a second time. I nodded, and she took a breath. I mocked your gift in front of 40 people because some part of me had already decided, before I ever unwrapped it, that you didn't have anything left to give me that mattered. I'd let Preston's fear about money become my fear, and somewhere in that I started measuring you the same way he measured everything, by what it was worth, not by what it meant. I looked at a box you spent 4 months building with your own hands, and I saw an old man giving me something small because that's all he had left to give. And I was cruel about it in front of people, because being cruel felt easier than admitting I didn't understand what I was looking at. And the whole time you were quietly protecting Sophie's future, and protecting me from finding out the truth in some worse way, and carrying all of that completely alone, because I hadn't given you any reason to think I'd have stood with you if you'd told me sooner. She stopped, and her voice, when she kept going, had gone unsteady. Mom used to say you never once, in 39 years of marriage, made her feel like she had to earn your patience. I made you earn mine. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry it took almost losing everything for me to see what I had. I didn't say anything for a moment, because I didn't trust my own voice yet, and because I'd promised myself, standing in that same workshop back in March with a photocopied fraud document under my desk lamp, that whatever I eventually said to my daughter about all this, I wanted it to be honest rather than merely forgiving. So I told her the truth, which was harder to say than any easy absolution would have been. I made a mistake too, I said. I let myself go 5 months without telling you what I'd found, because some part of me had decided you wouldn't believe me over your own husband, and instead of finding out whether that was true, I just assumed it and built a test around my assumption instead of a conversation. I should have trusted you sooner. I should have trusted that you'd choose your daughter over your fear. The moment you actually understood what was happening, instead of making you prove it to me first through a box you didn't even know was a test. I felt something loosen in my chest, saying that out loud. Some old tightness I hadn't fully named even to myself until the words were already out. I've spent a lot of years being the quiet one, who just endures things instead of saying what he needs. Your mother used to tell me that was going to catch up with me someday. I think it finally has. Vanessa crossed the workshop floor and put both arms around me, and this time neither of us let go quickly. Sophie, watching from the workbench with the particular solemn attention children give to moments they understand are important, even if they can't name why, slid off her stool and wrapped her arms around both our legs. And the three of us stood like that in the middle of that sawdust-smelling room for a good long while. And I will tell you plainly that I cried, standing there, in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the week Eleanor died, and that Vanessa cried with me, and that neither of us apologized for it or tried to hurry it along. When we finally separated, Sophie looked up at me with the directness that had already undone her father once at my dinner table and asked, "Grandpa, can I open the box? The real way, not the sneaky way Mom found." I laughed surprised and told her, of course, and walked her through it properly, showed her the pressure point, let her feel the small dry click of the false bottom releasing under her own small fingers, watched her lift the folded linen out with a gentleness that made my chest ache all over again. She held the handkerchief up to the light the way I'd seen restorers half her age never quite manage, careful, curious, unhurried. "Is this from when you saved Mom?" she asked. "It is," I said. She thought about that for a moment, turning the handkerchief over once in her small hands, and then she said, the thing that I think, more than the hearing, more than the trust restored, more than anything Walter or Harold or the whole crowded room of quiet witnesses managed to accomplish that October Sunday, finally set something all the way right in me. "So it's not a sad thing," she said. "It's the thing that means you kept her safe. That's not a scary blood stain, that's a love stain." She looked up at me, entirely serious, 7 years old and somehow wiser about it than the rest of us had managed to be in 40 guests worth of laughter 3 weeks earlier. "Can I keep the box in my room? I'll take care of it. I promise I won't ever laugh at it." I told her she could, once she was a little older and the box had done what it still needed to do in Walter's office. For now, I said, it would live on the shelf above my workbench, where I could see it every morning I came in to work. And she could come visit it any Saturday she liked. She seemed satisfied with that. Children generally are, once you've told them the truth plainly and let them decide for themselves what to make of it. Preston pleaded guilty to a single count of forgery. 3 months later, the district attorney's office, folding the broader fraud allegations into a plea agreement that spared everyone, Sophie especially, the ordeal of a trial. He received 18 months, most of it suspended in favor of probation, full restitution, and a permanent bar from serving as trustee or fiduciary on any account in the state of Georgia. Curtis Boyle's cooperation with prosecutors, as it turned out, bought him considerably less mercy than he'd apparently gambled it would. The district attorney's office, once they'd finished tracing the full extent of what he'd built out of Preston's desperation, charged him with a broader scheme involving at least 2 other overleveraged developers he'd maneuvered the same way. And his case, last I heard, was still working its way slowly through the courts. Vanessa filed for divorce the same week as the plea hearing. She and Sophie moved into a small rental 2 streets over from my own house that December, close enough that Sophie started walking to the workshop on her own most Saturday mornings, letting herself in the side door the way she used to as a much smaller girl, settling onto her stool at the workbench like she'd never once stopped. I finished the dining table I'd been slowly working on all that autumn. Cherry and rosewood. The same woods as the box, though I hadn't planned that particular echo when I started it, only noticed it once the piece was nearly done and understood, looking at it, that some part of my hands had been telling the same story twice without waiting for the rest of me to catch up. I didn't sell that table. I keep it in my own dining room now, and most Sunday evenings, Vanessa and Sophie come sit at it with me, and Dot when she's down from Macon, and we eat a meal together the way Eleanor and I used to, unhurried, nobody performing anything for anybody, the particular, quiet, ordinary happiness that I'd have told you, standing on that lawn 3 weeks after my 64th birthday, watching my daughter drop my gift onto a table like it disgusted her. I wasn't sure I'd ever get back. Sophie asked me once, not long ago, sitting at my workbench with the box open in front of her, why I'd decided to build a hidden compartment into it in the first place, instead of just telling her mother what I'd found. I thought about that question longer than she probably expected me to, because it deserved an honest answer rather than a quick one. Because some truths are too heavy to hand somebody all at once, I told her. You have to build something strong enough to carry them first. A box, a letter, a table, whatever it is. The carrying matters as much as what's inside. I ran my thumb along the seam of the false bottom, worn a little smoother now from all the hands that had opened and closed it since October. Your mother didn't believe what was inside this box the first time she looked at it, because she was only looking at the outside. It took her sitting alone with it, in the quiet, running her own hands over every part of it, before she found what was actually there. I think that's mostly how it goes. With people, too. You can't make somebody see what's true. You can only build something honest enough that, when they're finally ready to look closely, it's there waiting for them. Sophie considered that with the seriousness she brings to most things, then closed the lid of the box gently. The way you close something you've come to understand is worth more than it first appeared, and went back to sorting screws into an old muffin tin on the corner of my bench, humming to herself the way her mother used to, 30 years and one whole family's worth of trouble ago in the same quiet workshop, under the same steady light.